Okay, so in my last video talking about writing about Macbeth, writing peel paragraphs about Macbeth, with the quotations that we looked at, we were analysing mainly language, and I said to you guys, I said, listen, for AO2 in the AQA specification, AO2 is analysis of form, language, and structure. So you have to really be clear that in your essays, in your exam answers, you are talking about language, but you're also talking about structure and you're talking about form. So I thought I'd give a quick video just to talk about the differences between form, language, and structure in general, and then give you a few little tips that you can think about with form, because a lot of students find form difficult to think about. In my lessons, I've always said to you, we never refer to a book. And you've asked me, what's the difference between a book and a novel? And I will hold up a dictionary, I'll hold up an exercise book, a thesaurus, a novel, and a play, and I'll say, look, the book is what is kind of carrying the text, as it were. But the text is very different. A dictionary is very different to a thesaurus-ish, and they're both very different from a play, from a poem, from a novel. So when we're referring to play, novella, novel, and so forth, we are referring to the form. Okay. But anyway, that's just a general overview. Let's look at it in a bit more detail. Okay, so I want you to consider a building. So the form, when you're considering a building, is the type of building it is. So you could have a school, you could have a hospital, you could have a tower block, you could have a shed. Within a school, you can have different types of buildings as well. You can have the DT block is always quite different from say a sports hall, for example, or the maths classrooms. So the form is the type of building, and there you go, just in case you weren't sure what different types of buildings there are, there they are. Now the structure would be the design and the layout of that building, so the shape of the rooms, the height of the roof, the floor plan, etc. And again, another visual image there to get you all thinking about structure, design, and layout. And the language is the decoration, colour scheme, wallpaper or paint, curtains, blinds, all those little kind of flourishes that make the room, or that make the interior or the exterior for that matter, the aesthetics, as we will. And there you go. There is someone doing some DIY, not me, because I am rubbish. Mind you, I think I could handle a roller, a paint roller. Anyway, moving on. So, with that building, many buildings, you will see that the design and the decoration, so the language and the structure, is dictated by the type of building, by the form. So, for example, a hospital, probably an appropriate form of building to be discussing in the current coronavirus crisis. But anyway, a hospital, it needs wide corridors and automatic doors. Okay, so this is the design and decoration to accommodate large transferable beds. I didn't know this, but the lighting and colour in hospitals is chosen to create positive moods and reduce anxiety. So if you notice why a lot of hospitals have similar interior design, it's all because of that. And also the surfaces, of course, need to be easily cleaned and prevent bacterial growth. A police station, well, that will need secure entrances and exits. It needs a single access route to the cells. And conversely, unlike the hospital, it has its interior, it's quite harsh and austere. It's there to intimidate. They're not meant to be nice places. You're not meant to like going. So that's just to give you an example of how, with buildings, the design and the decoration is dictated by the type of building. And so when we are studying a text, the form, language and structure can be dictated by the type of text, the form of the text. Okay, so with Macbeth, I'm just going to list a few things for you in terms of form and context. So context is AO3, language, form and structure is AO2. And as I said, many people find form quite difficult to think about and include in your essays, but you're probably doing it without realizing it, not consciously. So as I go through, this might make sense. So the form, it is a play, and therefore you can talk about the staging, you can talk about any dramatic techniques that are used, the entrances and exits of characters. You can consider it as a performance, and how Shakespeare intended it to be performed. If you guys have seen a particular performance, either live or filmed, you can consider that as well. Consider the fact that it is performed in front of a live audience, and you know, if you think about it, there's a lot of repetition in plays, in Shakespeare plays, because there's a lot to take in. There's a lot of return. If you think about the fair and foul, so foul and fair a day I have not seen, I fear thou playedst most foully for it. That, you know, Shakespeare is giving us those reminders because it was intended to be performed in one hit in a couple of hours in front of a live audience. So it needs to be he needs to put those little those hints, because we can't necessarily go back and revisit the previous acts. By the way, you're hearing probably my email notifications coming through there. I should have turned that off. The act and the scene structure, now that is kind of overlapping with structure. There's another email, but you know, think about that, how Shakespeare spreads the narrative across the 5 acts, and how he breaks the acts down into the different scenes. Talking about soliloquies. Soliloquies, you should know, are the character's thoughts spoken aloud. So these may take place in terms of a couple of lines as an aside, or they could be whole speeches. The difference between verse and prose. Now, in Macbeth, there's about 3 or 4 examples of prose. When Lady Macbeth reads the letter, when the porter comes on, you should notice, although some editions I have noticed don't include this bit of prose, and some do, but in when Macbeth talks to the murderers, he talks in prose, and you talk about how he is kind of lowering himself in that sense. And Lady Macbeth in Act 5, Scene 1, she speaks in prose, and if you remember, verse, it's meant to be more sophisticated way of expression, so Shakespeare would reserve that for not just Shakespeare. This was a key convention of all theatre in the 17th century. Verse would be reserved for the nobler characters, so the princes, the dukes, the thanes in this case, and prose would be for the lowly characters. Hence why the porter speaks it. But of course, he makes exceptions in Macbeth, doesn't he? So he gives the witches verse, and he gives Lady Macbeth prose and Macbeth prose in a couple of bits of the play. Talking about the meter. So meter is a posh way of referring to the rhythm of lines. Well, when I say posh, it's the correct way, the correct terminology. So if you're talking about the rhythmic structure, so most of the play written in verse is in blank verse, and that's written in iambic pentameter. But the witches, of course, speak in trochaic tetrameter, and not only that, it's irregular tetrameter. So it's trochaic tetrameter should be 8 syllables, and if you count their lines, fair is foul, foul is fair, you'll see a syllable is missing, so it's irregular. But the point there, if you can't remember the difference between iambic pentameter and trochaic tetrameter, as long as you can get a sense that the witches speak in a different rhythm, and it makes them all stand out. The fact that it's a tragedy, you are talking about form, and therefore if you're talking about Macbeth as a tragic hero, talking about his hum martia, his fatal flaw, And oh, yeah, that's my video is cutting that off. There was one more bullet point. You're talking about his downfall and his death in relation to the tragedy. You're talking about form. So let's flip over to AO3 in context. James the First, he was James the Sixth of Scotland. He was very superstitious. The belief of witchcraft of Shakespeare's contemporaries. James the First believed he was a direct descendant of Banquo. I'm not too sure where historians would place that accurately, but James the First believed he was a direct descendant of Banquo, and who am I to disagree with him? He was, as I said, he was superstitious, and he was fascinated with witches. He believed that he was a victim of a plot against him by witches when he was James the Sixth of Scotland, and he wrote a book called Demonology, which was about witchcraft. The divine right of kings, you should know about that. So the belief that kings are monarchs, are kind of God's chosen subjects, and they rule divinely, and therefore that so when Duncan is opposed and killed, it's as good as killing God's appointment on earth, and that's why Macbeth is seen as a usurper, not the natural king. The Gunpowder Plot. This was Shakespeare's first play that he wrote for James the First. James the First came to power in 1603. Gunpowder Plot was 1606-ish, I think. Feel free to correct me in the comments. And again, that was a plot against James the First. So Shakespeare was really sucking up to his new patron. He wrote this specifically for James the First, so he included stuff that he was interested in. He set it in Scotland. He had Banquo as a great guy in the play. It was a warning about assassinating a king or attempting, treason. And of course, Gunpowder Plot is referred to in Act somewhere in the play. I can't remember exactly, but when they're talking about combustion, there's the reference to the Gunpowder Plot. Think about the patriarchal society. Okay, society ruled by men, both for the 11th century and the 17th century. 11th century is when it was set, 17th century when it's written. Think about how the women are presented in the play, and of course patriarchal attitudes towards gender, and how Lady Macbeth subverts that. And I would always get you to think about, particularly with her downfall at the end, is Shakespeare showing her within the traditions of the kind of archetypes of the female form being kind of weak? Does he show her in Act 5, Scene 1 as having that weakness, and whereas previously she was a strong, dominant, independent and forceful character, does he show part of her downfall, her to be this kind of frail, fragile, kind of little girl almost in that sleepwalking scene? Or is he just showing it as that part of her humanity? Should we really be looking at that as a representation of gender, or should we be just looking at it as a representation of being human? Think about religion, of course, the witchcraft and the divine right of kings all come into that. But those are the things you should be thinking about for AO2 with form and AO3 with context. Oh yes, there was one more there, the Machiavellian. So Machiavelli in his kind of guidebook on how to be a good ruler, and the Machiavellian as a character in a play, which is quite different from what the original Machiavelli wrote about, and where Macbeth fits into that, or what other characters fit into as a Machiavellian.